These artifacts represent the Coalition member species, each one abandoned. Instructor, that note says unknown philosophy. What does Coalition era mean for this timeline? The Combat History and Weapons Evolution module at Interstellar Coalition Academy ran every semester, a mandatory component of the comprehensive tactical education curriculum that every cadet completed regardless of their operational track specialization. The module's first session covered what Instructor Veleth consistently described as the universal trajectory, the documented pattern across virtually every Coalition member species in which increasingly sophisticated technology rendered hand-to-hand and close-quarters melee weapons obsolete, consigning them to ceremonial or cultural roles and eventually to museum contexts. It was, as Veleth regularly noted, one of the clearest demonstrations of civilizational progress available. The point at which a species no longer needed to be physically close to its threats to address them was, empirically, the point at which it began developing the capacities that eventually brought it to the stars. The display cases in the Academy's atrium had been assembled from authentic pieces across 50 years of Coalition cultural exchange. A Karvashi bone blade from an era predating their first orbital flight, a Moradi ceremonial impact weapon from 3 centuries before their fusion drive development, a Drainic liquid membrane tool whose function as a weapon had taken xenoanthropologists some time to fully decode. Each display case carried a plaque with species origin, estimated age, classification, and brief cultural context notes. The notes were consistent in their characterization. Ritual use following decommission, ceremonial preservation post-obsolescence, cultural heritage artifact. The human broadswords plaque read, Human Terra, class, melee weapon, origin, pre-coalition era. Notes, unknown philosophy. Rylan Ashby studied this plaque for longer than the other cadets spent on the entire display. His expression wasn't confused. It was the expression of someone performing a calculation. Instructor Veleth, recognizing the quality of attention Rylan was giving the display, approached. The unknown philosophy note, Rylan said, has been there since this exhibit opened, according to the archive date on the display case. He looked up. Nobody's updated it. The notation reflects genuine uncertainty, Veleth said. The classification team that assembled this exhibit could not determine the cultural framework behind the artifact's preservation. Most species' pre-technological weapons have clear decommission rationale, ritual significance, governmental collection, heritage preservation. He paused. This piece's provenance documentation contained notes suggesting it was maintained in active functional condition until comparatively recently, which the team found philosophically inconsistent with artifact classification. How recently? Rylan asked. Veleth accessed the exhibit archive on a nearby terminal. The provenance documentation for the human broadsword was more extensive than most of the other cases. Multiple pages of chain of custody records, maintenance logs, condition reports. He scrolled through the records. The most recent maintenance notation in the provenance record, Veleth said, reading carefully, is from a pause 47 years ago, which would be approximately 11 years after first contact with the Coalition, Rylan said, and before Earth's formal member acceptance. Veleth looked at the documentation more carefully. 47 years ago was not pre-coalition era in any meaningful sense. The artifact hadn't been ancient when it entered the exhibit. It had been a recently maintained, functional weapon. The classification as pre-coalition era refers to the weapon's design origin, Veleth said slowly, not its operational history. Right, Rylan said. The design is ancient. The practice isn't. He turned to look at the class behind him, which had gathered with the collective attention of people who'd noticed a conversation developing outside the expected parameters of a weapons history lecture. Sword-based martial practice has been continuous on Earth for roughly 3,000 years. It's not ceremonial. It's not heritage preservation. It's an active martial discipline. There are probably 60 million practitioners currently. The class absorbed this with a particular quality of silence that follows information that requires significant restructuring of a premise. 60 million? Said a Karvashi cadet, doing what appeared to be mental arithmetic. Approximately, Rylan said. Active practitioners of various disciplines. Fencing, historical martial arts, competitive forms. He looked back at the display. We also make new ones constantly. The sword design has been continuously developed for the same 3,000 years. The exhibit has an old one because whoever donated it had a newer model and thought the older one would be more contextually interesting. Velith was quiet for a moment, looking at the display plaque. The notation unknown philosophy had seemed adequate when the exhibit was assembled. It seemed considerably less adequate now. You practice? The Drenic cadet said. Not quite a question. Since I was 8, Rylan said. My father's side of the family has maintained continuous practice across 4 generations. My grandfather competed internationally. My mother's family has a different tradition. Their lineage goes back to a different regional practice. Different regional tradition, Velith said. You're describing distinct schools of a continuous 3,000-year practice. Several hundred distinct schools, Rylan said, some of which have significant philosophical, not just technical, frameworks attached to them. The unknown philosophy notation, Velith thought, had been produced by a classification team that had correctly identified it didn't understand humanity's framework and had incorrectly assumed the framework was absent rather than simply undocumented. I could update the notation, Velith said. The philosophy, Rylan said, is somewhat difficult to summarize in a plaque. He looked at the broadsword. The short version is that maintaining the capacity for something dangerous doesn't require a reason outside the discipline of maintaining it. The practice itself is the reason. The class was very quiet. Velith looked at the display case, at the broadsword that was approximately 700 years old but had been maintained in functional condition until 47 years ago, and considered the specific nature of a civilization that carried ancient weapons forward not because they needed them anymore, but because the act of carrying them forward was itself worth doing. I'm going to need to revise the module, Velith said finally, with the resigned tone of an instructor who has discovered that 3 semesters of curriculum contain a significant analytical gap. I'd be happy to assist with the research, Rylan said. I suspected you might say that, Velith said. The notation on the display plaque was updated within the week. It took Rylan 4 sessions with the exhibit team to produce language that was both accurate and brief enough for a display case. The final version read, Notes, the preservation, continuous practice, and active development of close-quarters melee combat represents an ongoing human cultural philosophy that cross-indexes with discipline, historical continuity, and the principled maintenance of physical capability. See extended reference document for full context. The extended reference document was 43 pages. Several months later, the Academy opened a new elective titled Comparative Martial Philosophies of Coalition Species. Enrollment exceeded expectations. Most cadets registered out of curiosity. Rylan enrolled because he noticed the reading list contained 3 historical inaccuracies. Instructor Velith quietly revised the syllabus before the second lecture. The end.